Hello, everybody. So, in this class, I'll be talking about Susan Glaspell's play Trifles. And it's just a short play, so I recommend that you read the play first and then watch this video. But let's talk a little bit of some background information about who Susan Glaspell is, our author, and where she got the inspiration for this play from. So, Susan Glaspell is a playwright. She also has a background as a journalist. Her dates are there listed on the slide. So she was born in 1876 and died in 1948. She published the play that we'll be reading, Trifles, in 1916. And her background is in journalism, as I mentioned. So she was a reporter and wrote for the local newspaper, as well as for some magazines targeting women, like Ladies' Home Journal and Harper's Magazine. She's an American writer, and she went on to actually win the Pulitzer Prize in 1931. But she's very influential as an American female writer, and there are some sort of feminist themes and ideas in Trifles that we'll be drawing our attention to. So the play revolves around a murder mystery, sort of, the circumstances of a man's death and the arrest of his wife for that murder. But this case of spousal murder is based on a true story, so it's kind of got this true crime inspiration. And the true story comes from this information that in 1900, John Cossack was killed, and the play is based around this person's death. So the death of this man in 1900, and his wife claimed that she had slept through his murder, and then she was later arrested for committing the murder. And it was quite a sensationalized story in all of the newspapers, and it was reported on because, it's very rare that, a wife would be arrested for murder of her husband at that time. And there wasn't a lot of female writers or reporters at that time. So Glaspell was one of the very few female reporters who actually spoke and wrote about this case. But like I said, it was very sensationalized. Would be, all over the news headlines, and was a very well-known case at that time. And Glaspell would later, be using the true story of John Cossack's murder, as inspiration for Trifles. So this is just a picture, a photograph of the real John Cossack, pictured here, and his wife, Margaret, pictured here, and the rest of the people are children in their family. But this would be their farmhouse where John Cossack was found murdered in bed. And it was very isolated, very much away from any neighbors, and it was quite bleak and depressing. Once Glaspell was reporting on the crime, she visited the farmhouse and saw for herself what those conditions were like living on John Cossack's farmstead or homestead, and how bleak and depressing and isolated. And there was just like an aura of darkness in the house that she kind of felt about that space when she actually visited herself. And it gave her a kind of new understanding of what Margaret's life was like and what led her to commit this murder. So the theme of kind of isolation is going to be a major sort of motivating factor, we'll say, in the death in Trifles, of the wife's anger and anguish, living in isolation, and the implication of also there was some sort of domestic abuse happening as well. So just for a little bit more historical context, if we think about what was going on in 1900 during this case and what women's lives were like at this time, it was, again, a time of very rigid gender roles for men and women. Women were very much still thought of as second-class citizens. They didn't have a lot of equal rights or freedoms. And in that case, they were very much sort of subordinate or oppressed as a group of people at that time in history and in America. So yeah, just some facts here on the slide. So women in the United States did not have the right to vote at this time, and they didn't get that until 1920. So again, without the right to vote, you're not really thought of or viewed as a citizen. You had no rights. Your life is thought of as an extension of your husband's, or in the case, if you were a daughter, of your father. You don't really have a clear sense of individuality or identity of your own. You're kind of thought of as a dependent or property of your husband or under your father's authority. So you're not a real person with autonomy, with the rights to vote, or even rights legally to determine your own path in life. And other things just related to women's criminal charges. So women were extremely unlikely to be chosen to serve on a jury. So women were very unlikely to serve on a jury. And this might be considered a problematic feature of justice, right? So how does a woman who commits a crime get a fair trial if all of the jury is just men? If the judge is men, the lawyers are men, and the jury are all men, will she get a fair trial? So these kind of questions didn't really come up at the time. It was just, accepted as the norm that you would have all male, judge and jury and executioners, and there would be no sense of equality or equal representation. And yeah, for many years, as I mentioned, the gender roles at the time were very restricted, very constraining to women as a group, not just to, the character in the play, but women's lives were very much defined by what we call the domestic sphere or the private sphere of the household. They were responsible or viewed as, or expected to provide, household management, cleaning, cooking, childcare, those kinds of tasks and responsibilities. And men occupied the public sphere, the outside of the home. So that's where they could, become the breadwinner, earn a living, and support their family financially. But because of their power and wealth outside of the home, women became dependent on men. So they were very much thought of as just an extension of man's property, his dependents, not unlike children or pets or something like that, right? So you're kind of not a person in your own right. So how are these historical facts pertinent to the play's themes? Well, we'll take a look at some of these themes that we'll discuss as we get into the play a little bit more. But some of the major themes that we'll look at while we're reading the play, things like gender roles and gender oppression of women, the way men are kind of blinded to the realities of what women's lives were like, being oppressed by gender roles, the difficulties of being a woman at that time in terms of getting justice, but also just in terms of things like isolation, and being protected under law against things like domestic abuse. So if abuse was going on, a woman didn't have a lot of recourse to protect herself. She couldn't, in many cases, get a divorce. She wasn't allowed to own her own property. She didn't have money of her own. Everything she was sort of given or provided by her husband. So she was very much dependent financially on your husband. And if he's an abusive man, you don't have a lot of recourse to free yourself from that situation. So you're very much sort of stuck or caged in this environment that could be very, damaging and toxic. And, we see that in Trifles. So yeah, women experience a lot of domestic abuse, and this might be verbal abuse, it might be physical abuse, sexual abuse, all of these different forms of abuse and what's implied around that in Trifles. Women would also maybe experience loneliness and isolation, especially for women who are in rural, farmsteads, often rural, remote areas. There might not be a lot of connection, and actually communication was a barrier as well. So just even having a phone line in 1900 was very rare. So you didn't have a lot of outreach or ability to reach out to others if you needed help. You were very much kind of at the you're vulnerable in your isolation. There's also ideas around regrets, and women sort of bonding as well. This idea of feminism comes up a little in the play about the female characters and where their sort of alliance or allegiance is to. Is it to the work that their husband's doing, or do they feel some sort of kinship and bond with the woman who's been charged with the crime? And then things like, yes, gender and law. So will a woman get a fair trial if she's being prosecuted by all male juries, lawyers, and judges? So is there a sense of injustice that goes, beyond just the home to societal or systemic forms of oppression against or based on gender? So these kind of questions or themes will come up in our discussion of the play. And there's also going to be a couple of symbolic things that pop up that tell us about what life was like for our protagonist. So when the characters are walking through John Wright's farmstead and looking for clues of what would bring his wife to commit the crime, they overlook a lot of the little symbolic things that are feminine or related to the domestic sphere. They kind of just overlook them, ignore them, and their perspective is more so about like the larger picture of the crime and looking for clues that way, and looking at the case from the perspective of men rather than looking at it from the perspective of women and what women's lives were really like at the time. But the two female characters who are kind of in John Wright's house accompanying their husbands, they see more evidence, or they see things that the men kind of ignore or overlook. And they can, feel more sympathy for John Wright's wife, Minnie Wright's, who committed the crime, but they see maybe more than they let on. And in a way, they come to sort of protect Minnie Wright from possibly getting a worser charge, as we'll see as the play goes on. But things like the little clues that you can look for in the story, like little symbolic things, objects that are present that tell us maybe a little bit more about what her life was like living under this abusive environment, where her husband was quite cruel and cold and uncaring towards her. But things like the dirty towels in the kitchen, the jar of preserves that explodes under pressure, her sewing, which becomes kind of erratic, and the knotted quilt, the bird cage, of course, and the little strangled bird that will become a key symbol, as well as laughter. So we'll look for these things while we're reading the play and sort of read into some of the symbolism there. We'll also go through a couple of questions from a question sheet as we address some key ideas in this play. And I'll include the questions in a little open forum that you can add to. But let's take a look at the play itself, and we'll highlight some key features in it. Okay, so I've annotated the play a little bit just to highlight some of the different roles. The cast is 5 characters. George Henderson, who's the county attorney, so he's the lawyer. Henry Peters is the sheriff, and Lewis Hale is a neighboring farmer. So those are the 3 men who are characters, the male characters. And then there's 2 women, Mrs. Peters, who's the wife of the sheriff, and Mrs. Hale, who is Lewis Hale's wife, and they're also accompanying the men as they do their search of the house for any clues or motives that they could use to prosecute their case. But if we look at the scene description, it kind of sets the tone, sets the scene. So the kitchen is in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright. That's where it takes place. It's a gloomy kitchen, and it's been left without having been put in order. So there's unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of uncompleted work. So this uncompleted work is women's work, right? It's the household management, cleaning the kitchen, putting the food away, preparing food, making sure your towels and everything are hung up and clean. So all of these things are kind of disheveled, dirty, and it's got this kind of gloomy vibe to it. So whatever she was trying to accomplish in that kitchen went incomplete. So as the men go around the house, they kind of do a survey, and they're looking for clues or anything that's out of place that would give them a clue of what exactly happened around the murder. And they ask the neighbor Hale what he noticed, and this is what he says. So Harry and I had started in town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to go see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John. So that's a little bit of a clue. It tells us a little bit about John Wright, who he was and how he was as a husband to his wife. This issue of a party telephone, so that would have been kind of a phone line that you would install in your house, and it would be sort of shared with your remote neighbors in a rural environment. And you could all sort of use the phone and stay connected that way. But John Wright didn't want the phone, so he's wants peace and quiet and no one to interrupt his life. And he also, in that description, is characterized as not caring too much about what his wife said or thought. Because Hale said he didn't, or his wife's opinion didn't make much difference to John Wright, is basically. So even if she wanted the phone, he would say, it didn't matter to him. It was his decision whether they got a phone or not, because all authority decisions came down to what the husband or man of the household wanted, not what the wife needed or wanted. So that's our kind of first indication of like this couple, the Wrights, they, something was not right with them in a way, right? So there was something dysfunctional about their marriage. It wasn't, and John Wright wasn't a very friendly man. He didn't like talking. He wanted peace and quiet, and he was rather cold and uncaring towards his wife, is the first impression that I kind of get from that description. So Hale talks, or is telling the sheriff what he saw when he visited and knocked on the door of the Wright household. And he says, when I got there, I knocked on the door asking to talk to John Wright, and he walked inside, and there was Mrs. Wright in her rocking chair wearing her apron, rocking back and forth. And he says she looked kind of queer, is his word. So something was out of sorts with her. And she was kind of pleating at her apron, sort of folding it up, while she's rocking in this chair. So the rocking chair going back and forth, it does maybe give a sense of kind of nervous energy, that something's not right. And he asks, is John home? So John Wright, her husband. And then she says, yes, he's home. And then he asks, can I see him? And she says, no, he's dead. And then she describes he died of a rope around his neck. And then she went on pleating her apron while rocking in the chair. So kind of just matter of factly saying that her husband is dead. So that's our first glimpse of Mrs. Wright in the aftermath of her husband's death. And then when Hale asks, what happened to your husband, Mrs. Wright just says,